I'm also a huge hip hop head. I used to just think about like my favorite artists and how a lot of them had like street teams in the early 90s and in the heydays. So just the things of like passing out flyers and posters. Actually, that might have been like the first real promo I did. And I put them in comic shops. We targeted all the ones here in Jax, and then we would think like, okay, what's the next town over? Meet the people working there, drop off a stack of flyers, put a poster up. The amount of times I can tell you where we would get an email or I'd meet someone that was like, dude, I love the show, picked up a flyer, or I've seen your poster at the shop I go to. So it was like a sense of like, we knew where our listeners are, right? Because like you said, it's a very niche thing, right? It's comic shop people. Being the biggest champion of your own show, the biggest advocate, being your own street team, and just getting the word out.
Everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm joined by Badr Milligan. Badr is the host of the Shortbox podcast. He's the founder of Jax Podcasters Unite, the local podcast meetup group here in Jacksonville, Florida. He's a regular on the Buzzsprout channel, and he was recently named the best podcast host in the 904, which is the greater Jacksonville area. Badr, thank you so much for joining me.
Dude, it is my pleasure. As a fan of everything Buzzsprout does and the YouTube channel and in interviews you've done, this is a big honor. Thank you.
We appreciate you doing it. You've been podcasting for a while.
December 2012 is when we finally put out our first episodes. 10 years officially is December 2012 is what I tell myself. So yeah, about 10 years plus.
For everyone watching, that is not, you're not misspeaking. That's over 13 years ago right now as we're recording this. Or I guess not over 13. Well, I don't know how to do math. That's over 10 years.
Yeah, this year will be this year will be 11 solid years of podcasting.
So what's changed in 11 years of podcasting?
Dude, everything, man. I think internally I've become a just more confident person. Podcasting was probably one of the better things I did in my life. In addition to like joining the National Guard, joining the military and getting those benefits, falling in love with this medium and, having this passion and this hobby and being dedicated to it for so long. I've seen so many different benefits outside of like, monetary stuff, but like from, just personal, like being more confident, having the ability to just like chat with people and, even like getting the job I have now. I work a daytime job as a project manager in marketing, but one of my selling points was I had my podcast on my resume because I felt like all the skills I learned in the sense of like collaboration and discussions and facilitating, conversations was applicable to like being a project manager. So, yeah, a lot has changed, like just I think internally, and then obviously like the tech, right? I mentioned having to wait on a tech guy to set up like some sort of website so we could have a hosting platform, and then he taught me like XML and how to manually update the RSS feed. Now you've got platforms like Buzzsprout where it's as simple as just dragging the MP3 and letting it do the rest. I do not miss the days of manually coding a notepad document or a note document.
Well, we're glad to take that little bit of it off your plate. How do you think that podcasting made you more confident?
I guess in a few ways. That's a good question. In a few ways, I'd say because we were getting into interviewing. I was interviewing people, obviously, I had never met. I had to do research. I had to come prepared. I had to speak confidently, too. I had to like lead the conversation. And you never knew like what, a person's background, walk of life was like until you really got into the conversation. So even like just being spontaneous, but while also listening, right? Like kind of walking that fine line of listening, queuing up the next question and maybe even letting the conversation go in places. So I think just being like that repetition, like practicing that muscle of like talking, being on, like aware, conscious. I think definitely just helped in the sense of like being just more confident in just like my everyday life, like, being out with friends and meeting new friends. And like, I sometimes I would have to catch myself like, Badr, this is not an interview. This is a normal person just out here having a good drink. You don't need to go into a 30-minute, like, find out about every detail of their life. But just like that constant practice of like talking with people and even among friends too, like I think there's something about spending the last 10 plus years of constantly listening and being hypercritical of obviously I kind of let go of the hypercritical after a while, but like something about hearing yourself talk and like understanding your mannerisms and certain tics and things. Like, I think, at first it's all very haunting. It's like the worst experience. You're like, oh my God, I sound like that. I talk like that. But then you start accepting like these things about yourself that make yourself unique. Because now you're listening, because I run a show with co-hosts. So I'm also hearing their tics and their unique attributes and appreciating, just like these small audio things that make us all unique. I think there's at some point I just became confident of like, well, this is who I am at this point, and I'm just going to own it.
Before we get too far, I guess we should bring up, what's your podcast about? It's the Short Box Podcast. What is the Short Box?
So the Short Box is a comic book talk show that I've been doing for the last 10 years. And I like to think that we've entertained listeners around the world with great conversations about comic books and pop culture topics. Founded by myself and two of my best friends, Andrew Torres and Walter Gant. It was started honestly in a comic shop years ago with my buddy Drew. Me and him are basically like long lost brothers. We love comics, the same music, the same movies. We have the same sense of humor. We then met Walt, who'd be coming to the shop when we'd work, and we would have like a podcast without mics in this comic shop. Like, we'd close down the shop and we'd be right out front of the store still talking about this stuff. And then one day, Walt got invited onto a podcast because he's got like this immaculate gift of gab. He could just talk to anyone about any topics. And through his podcast he was doing, he allowed us to use the mics, and we formed the Short Box. Obviously, the cast has changed. My co-hosts have changed. But the core of it all has always been the same. Talking about comic books and pop culture, interviewing some of the best creators in this industry. I think that's been another awesome benefit of doing a podcast, is that I've been able to pick the brains of, writers and artists and creators in this industry that I, have a huge sentimental attachment to. So that's a Short Box. And then I was crazy enough about 2 years ago to launch another podcast called the Next Spin Podcast. And that one's all about record collecting and talking about music. And I do that one with a different set of friends who are also, big talkers. We all love music. And that one's more of like just that one's my casual one. That's once a month. The Short Box is like, I got that on a military routine. Every Wednesday we're dropping episodes. That's the one I've been doing 10 plus years.
One of the things you mentioned in other videos or other podcasts I listened to was, these are the shows that you would be doing even if you didn't have a microphone. Like, you were already doing these podcasts by talking to friends and discussing these topics. And at some point you were like, why don't I just do this behind a microphone and put it out there for the world? How did you become, realize there was a thing called podcasting back in 2012 and realize like there might be other people out there who'd be interested in hearing this?
So Walt was part of this show called The Side Hustle. And it was a group of Walt and his friends. They would record on Fridays. That was a unique thing. And they would just talk about like the work week, like what was going on in politics. They were all big sports buffs. They loved music. So the conversations could go anywhere. And I believe Walt was my introduction, because he would tell us like, check out The Side Hustle. It's a podcast. And it's like, this was 2011, 2012, early 2012. So I was the biggest fan of that show. Like, I would tune in, I would text Walt if they missed a date, like, because obviously they weren't too sure of like what it could become, but I was like so enthralled with it. Even though I was talking to Walt like every week, I loved the banter of his co-host, and then obviously I started finding like my own podcast to listen to. Like, there was a one that Kevin Smith was doing that he still does. It's called Fat Man on Batman. That was like all about Batman and comic books. And then I found like a hip hop one called Juan Epstein. So I started finding my own like weekly listens, and I was using Apple Podcasts, and I was actually downloading the MP3s and putting them on like my iPod or stuff like that. So through Walt and then finding my own, and there wasn't it was a kind of a scarce selection, but I just started thinking like, what are my hobbies, and and then finding like names that I was familiar with.
That's really cool. One of the unique things you've done, Badr, is that you've been running a similar style podcast for over 10 years. You've been doing a conversation podcast, multiple co-hosts. Things have changed over the years, but I feel like more than anyone, you've had a ton of practice, over 300 episodes, kind of wrangling multiple co-hosts into a single conversation. What have you learned since you've been doing that?
I ended up learning to get a feel for the strengths and weaknesses of different people. I feel like I've always kind of been a good listener. At least my mom. Well, my mom might disagree with you at a certain age. I wasn't maybe the best, but I think it made me a better listener. And there is just something intimate about listening to people through headphones, especially when you're editing and trying to polish something, and making certain executive decisions about what stays, what goes, what's filler, or what you let ride out. So I think it made me a better listener, and someone that, and also it gave me the ability to, shine a spotlight on people's certain strengths. Like, for example, like my co-host Cesar, He's extremely funny. He's got, he can give you he could drop a monologue, a very thoughtful, thought-provoking monologue at the drop of a hat. So, I know that Cesar is really good on the fly. Ed is a researcher like me. He's doing homework before we record. He's got a vast knowledge of just stuff. So I'll look to Ed. I'll shine a spotlight on Ed when it's time to like get factual or share some tidbits. Ashley is a little more reserved, a little more quiet. I know that we can't overpower her, or we can't, we should avoid interrupting her when she's on when she's on a roll. Like, take a step back, let her shine. So I think it just made me, more in tune with like people's strengths and personalities. And I even carry that over to like my job. I mentioned I'm a project manager. A big chunk of that is facilitating meetings. You don't do a lot of talking yourself. You kind of, much like a podcast or an interview, you set up the topics. You throw out the topics out there and you kind of guide the conversation. And I utilize that, in my day-to-day, just understanding like, okay, what is this person good at? What are they comfortable with? Who's the subject matter expert? Who can take this? Who probably shouldn't, dive into this topic?
Yeah, one thing you just mentioned there was prep. I think there's quite a few people who hear conversation podcast or kind of roundtable discussion, and they think this is totally impromptu. It's not scripted, just like four friends around a couch and we turned on the mic. And that's not what your show is. So what does prep look like for a conversation podcast?
In the early days, we were not prepping at all. Me, Drew, and Walt, it was like really, it's night and day now when I listen back. And to be honest, me, Walt, and Drew still record. Like they're still part of the show. Hell, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, me and Drew drove down to Orlando to record with Walt. And that one was just strictly casual. Then whenever I got real serious about podcasting, I knew that it was time to like, I need to have topics. If I'm going to speak to news or changes in the industry or headlines, I should be like a little more informed. And I'd say that was such a big help in just fine tuning and polishing the show. Like, yeah, we can still, we can still have jokes and go down tangents and rabbit holes and things like that. But as someone that's like organized and, I've become a stickler for like, certain flows, having some sort of outline, helps out tremendously, because at least you know what the next goal is, what the next target is. Like we can spend some time here, but let's move on to the next one. And prep for me now, I'll say, I don't know why I was so hesitant for all these years to getting into like the Google suite. Like I was still using Excel at some point to like share things out. And then, my girlfriend Blythe was like, you should just be using Google Docs and in the Google Suite. There's no reason for you to be using Excel and Word. No one has that program. It's 2018, Badr. Come on. So honestly, Google Docs is my go-to tool for outlines. I realized that once I had a central place where I could put my thoughts about how an episode should flow, topics, and, even sharing like articles that I'm reading and sharing my bullet points and notes with my team made a tremendous change. I'll never forget Ashley pulling me to the side and saying like, hey, those outlines are great. Like I know what to expect. I know what points you might bring up. And if I disagree or agree, like I have a basis to work from. So it's been tremendous just having an outline and letting like your natural personalities do the rest, right? Like your foundation is the outline, knowing what you're going to talk about, the topics, and just letting your personality do the rest, fill in the cracks and like, give it some color and some life.
There's a bit of, once there's some structure, there's a little bit more freedom to just be yourself in the moment. If you don't have a little bit of that, here are the 4 topics we're going to go through. Here's the movie we're talking about, the comic book series we're talking about. If you don't have that, instead, now you're spending a lot of your brain space thinking, well, what am I going to say next? Okay, what point could we bring up? Okay, we haven't talked about this video. I think we should talk about this video. Okay, if no one's seen it, like there's so much prep that's going on in your brain. But once you know, there's this outline in a Google Doc and it says, these are the 5 things we're talking about today. Now you can just be you in the moment. And I think it leads to a much more authentic version of the co-hosts. And I don't know, you tell me, how does this affect you on the editing side? Because I'm sure it has a big impact.
On the editing side, it helps tremendously, especially in this day and age where, you're thinking social clips, you're thinking like sound bites from the podcast to, use to promote the show. So having an outline, I know, and let me take a step back. for editing, I know where we're at, like I know like this chunk of this audio is for this topic. I can, apply some timestamps. I also know like, hey, this is topical. This will probably, get a buzz on social media. I know that this topic is relevant. And then also have an outline saves you time in editing, because to your point, if you don't have an outline, it's just kind of rambling, right? Like you're kind of just coming on the fly with these topics, and maybe you end up spending way too much time on one and, not enough time on the other. I think it's just overall just, it's a huge time saver to have an outline to work from. On the editing side, you just know the flow and the certain beats, and you can make a smarter decisions about what stays and what goes. And, does this meet the goal of the episode?
You're very process-oriented, Badr. I think this is probably a bit of your military background, but also some of your project management, day-to-day job. 10 years in, what does the process look like for you from going to do an episode next week, prep, recording, editing, publishing, through the whole thing? Could you run us like at a high level? What does that process look like?
It's changed a little bit because some of my co-hosts, they've all started having kids. So like the team's down to a little more slimmer. I'm doing a lot more interviews. So the process is, instead of thinking like holistically and the entire team, I've been able to kind of just, it's been a little malleable of just myself. But the process for the longest time that was like just working for us is we'd record on Sundays. So by Monday, Tuesday, I had already, I knew what the topic was going to be. I kind of got into a good group. If we weren't having interviews, we were going to talk about news and headlines. If it wasn't news and headlines, it was going to be a comic book review, or we might do a movie review. It was like I kind of had certain buckets about what are the short box episodes: interviews, news headlines, movie reviews, book reviews. Those are the certain buckets. So Monday, Tuesday, I'd text the group, hey guys, Sunday at 1:00. Here's the topic. I'll have an outline by no later than Friday. Usually Wednesday, Thursday, I'll actually get the Google Doc outline made. That gives them all of Friday and Saturday to kind of prep. And then Sunday we record at 1:00, which gives me, it used to give me all of Sunday night and then Monday as well to edit. So I would edit those 2 days. Usually by Tuesday, I want to put it up on Patreon. It's also ready to go. It's scheduled for a Wednesday drop on Buzzsprout. Wednesday, I'll actually start cutting like promo and things like that. So it's like really rinse and repeat. Your big days being, like I said, Friday having the outline done, Sunday recording, Monday, Tuesday editing, Tuesday, Wednesday kind of cutting promos and thinking about the next episode.
That's really cool. One thing you kind of hint at a little bit there is some of the promo stuff. And you've done a lot of interesting things around growing your podcast. I think some of this comes from like the subject matter, comic book stores and like the physical medium. I use you as an example all the time because you've done a lot of promo around physical objects. Can you tell me some of these stories?
I think a lot of that inspiration comes from love music. I'm also a huge hip hop head. I used to just think about like my favorite record labels and my favorite artists and how a lot of them had like street teams in the like early 90s and in the heydays. So just the things of like passing out flyers and posters. That might have been like the first real promo I did. I got some terribly designed posters and flyers and I put them in comic shops. Me and Drew would use Saturdays. We'd link up on Saturdays and just drive to a comic shop. We targeted all the ones here in Jax, and then we would think like, okay, what's the next town over? Let's go there. So Daytona would be the next week. And we'd go to comic shop, meet the people working there, drop off a stack of flyers, put a poster up. The amount of times I can tell you where we would get an email or I'd meet someone that was like, dude, I love the show, picked up a flyer, or I've seen your poster at the shop I go to. So it was like a sense of like, we knew where our listeners are, right? Because like you said, it's a very niche thing, right? It's comic shop people. We're comic people ourselves. We know how they think. They're going to be at the shop like every Wednesday or enough times to hopefully see this. So things like the physical, I still print flyers to this day when I go to the shop. Like for Free Comic Book Day last week, I gave Ben a stack of flyers. Like, dude, if you don't mind putting this in the in a bag for every single person,
You had one time, I think, where you were like overseas in Germany or something, right?
That's right. Thank you for reminding me of that. Okay, on the topic of that, anytime, hell, the Vancouver trip is a good example. I always pack a stack of flyers, like little flyers, right? Because I know when I go travel, there's two things I'm definitely going to do. Well, maybe three. I'm going to eat as much food as I humanly can, right? I'm going to eat my weight in good food. But I'm also going to go to a record shop and I'm also going to go to a comic shop because I love visiting other countries, other states, shops and seeing how they do things. For my first deployment when I was still in the Air Force, and Cesar was my co-host. Cesar was also in the same unit. He's actually a big reason why I got into the Air National Guard. But in 2015, we had our first deployment. It was my first deployment at that, and we went over to Europe. We went to, it was 3 months, 1.5 months in Holland, and then the last half in Bulgaria. And so me and C had to take a little break from the podcast, but my co-host kept it running. But I took a bunch of flyers, and on our downtime, we'd go to comic shops, just drop them off. And I think when we were in Holland, it was Free Comic Book Day. And we were like, dude, we got to like check out how Holland does Free Comic Book Day. So we went to this shop, and they had a signing with an artist that we were both huge fans of. We were like, whoa, what are the chances of us being here at this time? And I took a shot. I asked the owner, hey, I'm from America. I got a comic podcast. I remember him thinking like, what is that? Like, I remember actually him thinking like, kind of being like, kind of amazed, like, whoa, these American guys like, got a show. So we got to use that to our advantage. And he was like, oh, some guy from IGN Netherlands is here. He's going to do an interview. Talk to him. And we talked to him, and he was like, well, how about we just do a joint podcast together? And, I got a sweet interview. It was actually really funny because he had a little hand-recorded mic, and he was waiting on the line to die down. And the line eventually did die down, but there was no quiet place in this shop to record the interview. So we stepped right outside the shop, and we huddled. It was myself, Cesar, I think the guy's name was Jay, and then the artist and his manager. We all huddled up together across the street from the shop. It was raining slightly, so we were underneath this cover, and there was a little recorder in the middle, and me and Cesar are like, this is the coolest thing ever. This interview is going to go on IG Netherlands, and we're going to get the audio for ourselves. So it's just like, those moments of just always kind of being in like, being the biggest champion of your own show, the biggest advocate, being your own street team, and, just getting the word out.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I remember you saying once you can actually still go back to your stats on Buzzsprout and look at some of these different countries and be like, there it is. There's a little pocket in the Netherlands. There's a little pocket over here in Bulgaria.
Yeah, it's definitely, I always get a little chuckle anytime I see it from like Holland or the Netherlands. And, even like my little, like one of my best friends, Greg Parrish, who I met actually in boot camp, and he ended up being he made our first intro song. He actually made the first 5-6 intro songs. He became like our go-to music guy because he produced. He was doing a lot of deployments himself, and I used to just give him like short box promo, like a hat, a shirt, whatever we got. And he would wear it at bases, and he would meet other nerds, right? It was kind of like a calling card. Like if you knew what the shirt was, or because we would have the Infinity Gauntlet, he would spread the word too. So for a while, I was getting plays in like Saudi Arabia and then Doha and all of that. And it was like, oh, that's Greg's work right there.
It's so fun when you do a little marketing push and you can see it and you know exactly where it came from.
Yeah.
Whether it be like the day that a big promotion drops, or you're looking at the stats, you go, I know when it's Saudi Arabia, I know where we got those listeners from.
Maybe the most proudest promo, or, just thinking outside the box in the sense of, getting the word out and, doing it via the show there was a stint from 18, 19, where we were doing so many live shows. We were our first one was done at the Museum of Science and History here in Jax. They had the Science of Superheroes exhibit, and I talked them into letting us do like a live show. And that was our first one. And then like a few months later, we did a live show at a comic shop because it was like, this makes sense. Why haven't we done this before? And then we started doing like the live shows at movie openings. Like we would team up with Sunray. Anytime they had a Marvel movie, we'd offer to, intro the movie, do some giveaways, and then do a live show right after. And I got to say, those were probably some of the funnest times of doing the podcast. And all 10, 11 years, doing that run of just it felt like live shows once a quarter. And they were so thrilling, right? Just like being in front of like a live audience, and I know that played a big role in getting our name out, because then people could put, the faces to the voices, and that was awesome.
I just did an interview with Tom Buck. He kind of talked about the crossover between being a teacher and being able to see like what resonates with students and what doesn't, and how that translated to him on YouTube. And it sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing. You were a podcaster, and then the live shows, you got to actually see the energy in real time from your audience.
Yeah, and you feed off that so well, and you get like a second, third win. Not only you get like energized in the moment when a joke hits and you've got like a group of, an audience laughing and reacting. It's all, and then, the ability to also play off the audience and have them involved too. Like I think a majority of our shows, we would do a little Q&A and, let them know like, hey, you're going to be on the show next week. And of course, people get excited. Now they're sharing the show, telling their friends, and, it was just all around beneficial. I mean, a lot of prep work in the sense of like really making sure that your outline was on point, because now, you can't run over the time. If you got 45 minutes, you got 45 minutes, because now you've got like staff involved. They got to shut down the building, things like that. So having it was just like, it really pushed us to like perfect our chemistry, perfect the show. And I bet you I could finally find a correlation between the quality of shows and our chemistry pre and post, the live shows.
You've also been doing quite a bit recently with TikTok and Reels and YouTube Shorts. What have those experiments looked like?
I'm going to tell you this. I think it's just because of how long I've been editing. I think it's safe to say for a lot of podcasters that, do everything for their show. Editing is always like, that's the tough part, right? Like sitting down, and especially when you're as OCD as I am about certain things. That can be very time consuming. That can feel like you're just stuck in this void. Granted, I've found ways to like really improve it, make it faster, and have a lot more fun with it. But cutting promos in video, especially for social clips, is it's been a fun. I can try new things, different graphics. I'm also looking at like, because I watch a lot of YouTube channels as well, seeing like what they do, how it works, incorporating that on a much smaller scale as well. And I found that like our growth too, has definitely benefited in the, download stats and new listeners coming from, especially like TikTok for myself. Matter of fact, I met someone over the weekend when I was at recording some interviews at Free Comic Book Day. This guy, walked up, I was, hey, can I interview you? He was like, I'm going to say no to the interview because I'm shy as hell, but I just want to say I came across your content on TikTok. I love it. Keep on doing what you're doing. And it made it so worth it, right? Like whenever you get one of those, it makes it so worth it. And I genuinely have fun listening to an episode, and having made that a part of my process really felt seamless, because you're listening back. One, you already know what your outline looked like because you wrote the outline. You also lived in the moment of recording the podcast. And then there's this third layer of like listening back and like making notes. And, even when I'm recording, sometimes I know a moment is a clip. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to make sure this is like a promo I cut. And I think it just, obviously we don't do a lot of live shows now, but I feel like using TikTok and making the reels and videos is like giving us a certain personality, insight into like who we are, like putting faces to the voices, I think it's an interesting tool, and I highly recommend, more people utilize, promos and things like that for their podcasts. I know it's benefited us big time.
Are there other marketing strategies that you've played with? I know at one point you were doing some ads. Did that ever turn into anything?
So it could either be one of two things. I am a big believer in running ads on podcast platforms, because the one thing about like that TikTok or that interaction, for example, there's no way that I could have correlated the two, right? Like the success of a certain video or something, meaning how many subscribers. There's no way for me to be able to pinpoint where that guy, what video finally, got him to check out the podcast, etc. But so I don't run a lot of ads on like social media unless I'm doing like a giveaway, or when we were doing live events, I would always like, boost a post to push and make sure people came out for the live show, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm a big advocate and believer in buying ads in podcast platforms like Overcast or Podcast Addict. Even Buzzsprout. I've purchased a few ads on Buzzsprout. And to me, that is a good use of money, because by the end of the ad, most of them run for like a month, right? You get to see like a direct correlation of here's how many subscribers, here's how many people saw your ad, clicked it, and then decided to subscribe. And, on average, I've gotten from, low end 20 to high end of like 32. And when you think about it, that's like, man, that's to pay money to just run an ad and get some subscribers. I mean, it's not a lot of, it's not rocket science. It's not a lot of work. But I do think it's probably the best use of your money if you're looking to like really push and promote and go about that means of marketing, because once again, you're going right to where your audience is. Like, I know that comic shops work because, that is my niche. But from a general standpoint, this is where podcasters are. Like, you are not on Overcast or Podcast Addict if you're not, if you don't listen to podcasts. That just doesn't make any sense. But you could be on TikTok for any other reason, right? It's a little too wide, So just kind of going in on a focused route.
There were years that the only way you could get somebody to listen to your podcast, because most people weren't listening to podcasts yet, try to pull up the Apple Podcasts app on their phone and be like, all right, this purple app, like click it. And we could search for anything that you want. And they're like, for free? Like they expected to have to pay. And you'd pull open a show and say, here's mine. You not only had to overcome the hurdle of you would want to listen to this particular show, but also had to overcome the hurdle of I don't have any idea about why I would listen to a show. I've already got the radio, I already have music, and you're trying to sell them on a whole new medium. The benefit of using podcast apps or advertising in other podcasts is these are already podcast listeners. So they know step one is done. And now all you have to do is say, hey, this second show, this is a show that you might be into.
Agreed, 100%. And you just brought back some flashbacks of basically playing tech support early on in those podcast days, like meeting people, them, saying, so what do you do? I'm like, oh, I do a podcast. And like, what is that? Oh, that purple, like you said, that purple icon on your iPhone that you probably have hidden or you've tried to delete. Yeah, this is what it does. And, like walking, I vividly remember walking people through podcasts or the day I told my dad about it, he was like, oh, what? Even like for the longest time I just told my mom, Mom, it's Sunday. I'm going to go record my talk show, my radio show is what I would call it. Cause it was the closest thing that made sense for her, that she could wrap her head around, what I was doing. But yeah, I've had a lot of luck with, I try to run an ad, once a month. I look at that as an extra boost. Like really the hard work to me comes into, establishing a brand online and, cutting those promos and those reels and those videos. And, to me, that's fun. The ads to me is an extra boost. If I've got the disposable income, I'll run an ad for a month, try to get some new subscribers, hope they stick around. But when you look at the cost, I think the cost per click, for running an ad, it's like, it comes out to be a pretty good deal.
Do you justify that because you're having a ton of fun podcasting, or is it that you can kind of see on the back end, I'm putting money in and then I get money out on the monetization side?
I don't know if it's too much on the latter versus the former. I think I've love podcasting. I think I'm a little crazy at this point about it. I don't know what I would do without it. I don't know if I can correlate or justify sometimes the return on investment. I don't know how many of our patrons, Patreon subscribers or paid listeners came from those ads. I think there's just a sense of like maybe maybe blind hope of like, if one Patreon subscriber out of these 100 of subscribers is enough. But I think it really just falls into that. I do enjoy podcasting. I do enjoy like having this brand and having these loyal listeners. And I'm just looking to continue growing it. And if they become if I get a return on investment or I get a paid subscriber, then awesome. But it's not, I don't think it's my, most immediate goal when I buy an ad. I think at this point, it's like, you gotta get the word out how you can, right?
Yeah, you absolutely do have to get the word out. I love the way you think about monetization because on one hand, you have monetized a handful of different ways, and we should get into all of those. On the other, you took 5 years before you ever monetized, and you were doing this for the joy of it. And you were getting a lot of like non-monetary benefits from the podcast. I know you probably won't bring all of these up, but like you've had to interview some really cool people, definitely built a name for yourself in the local community, but also larger comic book community. You got to do a TEDx event. There's lots of events now where the Short Box has some kind of presence because you've been doing this for 10 years. And when you continuously show up, you start to get some cool opportunities.
Yeah, well said. I think at some point, I just realized that, I wasn't going to be, I wasn't going to get rich off this. I don't, and it was going to take a lot to replace like, my day-to-day job and, for me to take that jump. So I kind of just settled on, all right, well, if I'm not going to make a bunch of money on this, at least let me cover my costs of what I, paid to actually run a podcast. And let me focus on opportunities, right? If I can't get a bunch of money, then let me just focus. And it was never honestly about money. To your point, I had been podcasting 5-6 years before I even decided to launch. I think we launched our Patreon in 2017 or something like that. And it was only because at that point we had built such a loyal fan base that were looking to support us in some way. We had no merch. I think we had like a Tea Republic or something like that. But we had no like means of like people giving us money or supporting us financially. And eventually one of our listeners, a good friend of mine, Nick Wagner, who runs a very successful, he's a super smart business guy. He runs a really successful tattoo shop. He even owned the comic shop I used to work at some point. He was a huge fan of the show, always a huge advocate, always like our biggest champion. And one day he was like, dude, stop playing around. Set up a Patreon so people can like support. Like we want to support. He was like, I remember saying, I think I speak on behalf of the Shortbox Nation. We want to support you guys. Let us give you our money in some way. So I just, once I got over like, okay, well now I'm asking people for money, am I going to get heartbroken if it's, only one person? I kind of brushed all that to the side and said, just let it happen. If someone supports or wants to give us their money of their own free will, awesome. Launch the Patreon. We had like I want to say it was like 20 people sign up within like the first like half a year or something like that. So it was like, oh man, this is okay. Well, let's see what else we can do. And then we eventually started like thinking outside the box of like, oh, let's, because Ashley and Ed are both artists. It was like, well, let's go ahead and create like unique prints. Let's posters and things like that people can support, to have like a piece of the short box. So there was that, but mainly it opened up just the doors to a lot of different opportunities, right? Like I was already going to comic conventions. Well, I started just reaching out to the people that would book the guests and asking like, hey, can I help, run a panel or host a panel? All I ask in return is I just get to keep the audio recorded, right? So now I'm thinking of like, well, opportunities that'll also just feed back into the show itself, kind of like, just this machine. So I was getting invited to things like comic conventions to host panels with creators that maybe didn't have a shot with, or they're not very into like, doing interviews. Well, now there was a means of me getting interviews and content to feed back into the show. And now people are wanting to support like, oh, let me sign up for the Patreon, help these guys out, upgrade the equipment, cover like their travel costs, because I know I'm going to get, something, cool content in return. But yeah, between like the comic conventions, being able to speak at TEDx, I think once I realized that I wasn't just a podcast host, but I could apply those same skills of facilitating a conversation, having a good time. Like, to your point, like I started thinking more so as a brand, myself as a brand. It was like, well, I could take these skills anywhere that needs someone to hop on a mic. Like I've been doing it for 10 years. How much different could it be in front of a person? So yeah, having that mindset, thinking outside of the box of just seeing dollar signs, but, seeking opportunities that would just boost the brand and the podcast itself was huge.
Cool thing about the Patreon is that somebody else told you to set it up, because I think there's a lot of podcasters who don't set up a Patreon or they don't set up a Buzzsprout subscription because they think there's probably nobody really wants to give money to it, and I'm going to feel weird if I start asking. On the other side, as a listener, like one of my favorite shows a few years ago just stopped. And the two of us were like, well, we're not making any money. Doesn't seem like this is going anywhere. So I don't really know why we'd keep doing it. The whole time was thinking I should reach out to them and tell them, hey, set up a Patreon, set up a way that I can start giving you money, because it was 45 minutes once a week where I was cracking up and I was having a great time. And I thought it was amazing. And now that thing has disappeared. I would gladly pay $5 a week for that.
When you look at the costs that you're asking someone, I think once I got over that initial kind of awkward thing of like, hey, can we get like some money to help us out? It's very time consuming. I think once you just start becoming honest and confident too of like, look, and at that point I had a little more clout to stand on, right? It's like, guys, been doing this 5-6 years. Obviously it's costing us more money to produce the show. We want to make sure we're giving you the best quality. So now you're thinking about equipment, hosting fees, and just the time itself, right? Like the time I'm spending editing, we all are, doing the podcast, editing, coming up with ideas, and just the energy you give to it. I guess I just stopped feeling bad about asking for, I think our highest tier at the time was like $9. And then I eventually bumped it down to $7. It's like $5, even $2 a month. I guess I just got over I was like, you know what? I'm just going to put it out there. And it's a free show anyways. If you could always skip it too. If you want, you could skip my, my shameless plugs and just go on to the main stuff. It's never going to stop, you from enjoying the show. But I think just having a confidence in the product that you're putting out. If you know you're putting out a good product, I don't think it's weird or anything to ask for a little help, financial support to keep the lights on.
Adam Curry is the co-founder of podcasting, like the actual podcasting spec, co-founder of Podcasting 2.0, which is trying to innovate on the podcasting spec and move podcasting forward, and the Podfather. And he also started this thing called Value for Value. And it's just, hey, I'm giving you something. You get it for free. There's no obligation. There's no string attached. If you get some value, you determine what that's worth for you, and then you can give that value back. It's such a positive thing to do because for some people, $2 is a lot of money. There was a period in my life where if I was giving $2 a month to a podcast, that would have been really tight. But now if I'm going, $5, $10 a week for my favorite show, of course I would do that. Allow your audience to set the price. Like, what value are you getting from this? And what is it worth to you? And what's appropriate? And allow your audience to come alongside you. That's why I was so excited when we built Buzzsprout subscriptions, because you just turn it on and you don't have to do anything else. And all that happens is if people want to do it, then they can give you money. If no one wants to do it, you never have to think about it again. You just move on with your life.
Agreed. And I think also just having the security of, a full-time job took a lot of that pressure off too, where I got to just have a little fun with it, like making jokes about, supporting, just like making it a little more fun. It didn't feel like I was, pressuring any of the listeners. We just had a good time and, a lot of self-deprecating humor that goes into us asking for money. But, we also made it really worth it. That was something that was like, I had a hard time wrapping my mind around when I first launched a Patreon, is like always questioning if it was worth it to anyone. Like, am I putting out enough bonus episodes? Are they getting these episodes early? I'm promising early access. I'm, telling them they'll get this. Like, I was, the first couple months of that Patreon launch, it was a lot of pressure. I was putting myself through a lot of pressure of trying to think of, a little bit of doubt, but also like thinking about things that maybe I didn't need to. Overthinking how people felt about the content we were putting out. But our numbers had never dropped. And I think I started like doing surveys and I was like, hey, you guys getting enough bonus episodes? And I think some of the response they got was like, I'm almost getting too much content from you guys. I can't even keep up. And, and just kind of trusting and I think I started just trusting myself a little more. I'm putting out quality content. I think the people can see that this is not a cash grab, and just kind of believing in the audience that I built up, that they knew where my heart was at.
Yeah, the $2 to $7 a month cash grab doesn't ever seem to pay off.
Well, I said one guy, I remember, one of our listeners was like, dude, I'm paying this much for this podcast here, and they haven't put anything out in like months, and I'm trying to keep up with what you're putting out. Yeah, so that was really good.
Another thing, and I think this was probably how we first got connected, that you did in 2018, I think, you started Jack's Podcasters Unite, which is the local Jacksonville chapter, the Jacksonville meetup group of podcasters. What got you to start that?
It was April 2018, and it was myself, Life Brumleaf, and we had I call him our hidden third member. Like in very rich political families, there's always like that one black sheep son that they're like, look, we'll pay you to like stay out of the cameras. That is our Ryan Paul Thompson.
It's like the third Bush son. And you're like, oh, I know about the two. What? There's a third?
Ryan Paul Thompson being that. Me and Life always joke, he's like a black sheep child. It's like, Ryan, let us get this. But no, Ryan was kind of like an advisor. And I remember talking to Blythe, because obviously she's been podcasting for a long time, almost as long as I have. And I remember I had this idea, like, I think that another meetup series, that it was called like the local Jack's artist meetups. And it was like, graffiti artists, painters and stuff like that. And I remember thinking like, man, I wonder if I started meeting more podcasters like here and there. It was almost like a secret club oh, you do podcasts? Oh, me too. Well, check out, this and that. So I just had an idea, like, I wonder if I just put the call out, like gave us a location to meet up, a time and date, who would show up. And we did our first meetup in April 2018 at, it's now closed, but it was Space 42, a huge gallery in like this warehouse, plenty of space. I put the word out. I think I did like a Facebook event page, and the turnout was so overwhelming. I remember being in that moment, and it was like, we had a sign-in sheet, and I only had like printed 2 sheets. I think it was like either 1 or 2, and we ran out. It was like, holy crap, we've got at least 50 people here. And in that moment, that was when the Jax Podcasters Unite was born. Because at first it was just like, hey, Jax Podcasters meet up here, take place. But at that moment, it was like, we got to continue doing this. We got to meet so many people. And it was just so refreshing you mentioned like for podcast listeners, like that using apps, you're ready at first base. Well, these guys were running home runs already. Anything you brought up, like the pains of podcasting, the behind the scenes stuff, there was like this community you could relate to. And I remember like we were asking people to come up on the mics and share any questions they had, and all the questions and things they had, it was so cool to see certain hands go up like, oh, I can help you with that. Oh, I know exactly how you feel. So yeah, we've been doing that since 2018, and it's crazy to think it's now 5+ years of doing this. And
yeah, don't ask me to do the math again after I said you've been podcasting for 13 years.
Like, it's just crazy to think like the different podcasters we've met, help people that have come to our events without a show and then launched one shortly after. It's probably my second, aside from like the short box being like my baby, the thing I'm super proud of. This is a very close second of like building this community.
It really is a wonderful community. Now I go and think of how many cool and interesting podcasters and just interesting people that I've met by going to the meetups. And it is such a refreshing thing. Podcasting can feel pretty isolating. Like it's a one-way street between this mic and people listening. And sometimes they reply, sometimes they leave a mean review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, but like mostly you just don't hear a whole lot back. Everyone's like kind of wants to connect. And at some point, your friends and family are tired of you saying like, I'm trying to figure out the gain settings for this mic. And you go to the podcast meetup, someone raised their hand and like, I was just testing out the script and it's like so crazy, but I can't do this anymore. And then someone else is like, oh no, you actually can do that. Here's the setting. Oh, and they get together on a computer and they're showing each other how they, set up their workflows. Or people are letting each other borrow gear so that they can get a recording and see if they want the gear. In the end, like the reason we're doing all this stuff is to connect. And it's such a joy to be able to go to these meetups and connect with other podcasters. So on behalf of the Buzzsprout team, we really appreciate getting to go to these.
It's a big honor to have you guys so involved. Like I'll never forget the day that me and Blythe were sitting on the couch planning something for the JPU. And I think at that time I still hadn't converted over to Buzzsprout or something like that, or I was still hosting it on, I don't know, something weird. And I remember she had scrolled to the bottom of an email you guys sent, and she was like, hey, come take a look at this. Is this a Jacksonville address? And, just being able to read that day that we reached out and all that, it's been great having you guys as partners. And I wanted to say in regards to just like the overall exuberance about the meetups, it always seems to come at the right time. To your point, podcasting, sometimes it feels like you're in a silo, like no one else gets it, it's just you. And those meetups always seem to arrive when I need to be reminded about like why I do this or why I love this medium. I'm burnt out. I'm feeling burnt out. I want to put the podcast on break. I feel like no one is in on this. And then I'll go to these meetups and, hear other people also, they're going through that and they have solutions, or, they're giving you a supportive leg. It's always like a breath of fresh air. It always like rejuvenates and re-energizes me to like, keep going and try new things. And also like, just reminds me how much I love the medium that you can find a show for every, or a topic or a show for every topic. Like the amount of like sports podcasts, self-help and all that. It's like, wow, this is so cool that there's so much diversity in this medium.
There really is. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a tidbit on the Buzzsprout side, Blythe starting her podcast with us. So for people who are watching, Badr's girlfriend and co-founder of the Jax Podcast Unite group, Blythe, was on the radio in Jacksonville for a few years and had a show called Helmets and Heels. It was women talking about sports. I heard the show and knew who she was from that. And one day, and this is probably 2018, where I'm going, Buzzsprout is small enough that I'm still going going through and looking at when people sign up. And then I see Helmets and Heels signed up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, someone is obviously ripping off this show. And then I see the email address and everything associated with it. And went, whoa, we've arrived. Like people that I know are now using Buzzsprout. So it's a very cool moment for us as well. Badr, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us and kind of tell us what you've learned over 10 years of podcasting. If there was one thing you could give to a new podcaster, someone who still has not launched, what piece of advice would you give them?
Aside from just do it, I will say, be a fan of the medium first, right? Like, listen to podcasts, like, have a favorite, make it a part of your routine. Because when I look back at when I first started, those first couple of podcasts, Walt's podcast on the Side Hustle, the Juan Ep Hip Hop podcast, and Fat Man on Batman, I took a little bit from all of them. And I really structured the show based on, those elements that I liked from these shows, the way they interviewed or this segment. And that was my structure for a while. And then eventually I got my own legs underneath me and I, got my own confidence and, had a different vision. And I just, tweaked them and made them my own. So I'd say listen to podcasts, become fans of podcasts and, take from your favorite, I'm going to butcher the saying, but all great artists steal. Don't be afraid to look at another show and how they're doing. Obviously, put your own flair on it, but don't be afraid to look at another show when you're first starting out and incorporate the things you like. I think when you start seeing how other shows do it and when you appreciate the variety and where you could go, I think it's very inspiring and kind of takes the pressure off from having to build this show. Because now you're incorporating certain elements, and at some point, with enough dedication and longevity, it's going to become your own thing. So I think when you're first starting out, look to other shows that you enjoy and ask yourself, what do I like about them? How can I make things my own? And kind of have that as an outline.
That's great advice, Badr. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we'll have to get you back for round 2.
That sounds awesome. Thank you so much, Alvin.